Welcome to Expositions. I'm Kevin Rhodes. Today, we find ourselves surrounded by conflict in about every aspect of life. Even the places we used to run to escape the mayhem are now filled with ugly reminders of an angry world. At the same time, we are seeing regular advances against Christianity in both government and society. The schools have been a place where Christianity is mocked and appeals to God are silenced. Senators are arguing in favor of a patently unconstitutional religious test to deny people who actually believe in the Bible the opportunity to hold office. Ethics are being rewritten in some professions in order to automatically exclude Christians. The pressure on Christians from all of these external sources seems to be expanding exponentially. But these matters, while important, are small in comparison to the daily adversity that people face that is totally unrelated to politics or society. Hardship can come in many forms. It includes the major health problems that fill announcements across the land. It includes the sorrow of people grieving the loss of loved ones whose lives will never be the same. It includes the challenges people face just trying to put their lives back to normal after a natural disaster. I remind you of all these things to point out this simple fact. You will face adversity in life. But it is also true that we do not always make the best decisions in the midst of that adversity. In fact, adversity can wear us down so much that we have no energy left to resist temptation and trial. And so we just give up. And when we do that, we can make a lot of poor decisions that will hurt us in the long run. The book of Ruth begins by recounting the adversity that a family faced during the days of the judges. And it wasn't just one thing. So listen carefully as we read in Ruth chapter 1, and we begin by looking at verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. In the remainder of this chapter, we see how Naomi and Ruth, in particular, responded to all of this adversity. And their story of adversity illustrates the challenges we face within as part of human nature, as well as the possibilities there are once we overcome them. So you have a woman who is removed from her homeland, who has lost her husband and lost both of her sons. That, my friends, is adversity. And that means that we ought to be able to relate in any problem we face to what we see in Naomi here. So the first thing I want us to consider is found in verses 6 through 9. And it is this basic lesson. When we face challenges, we tend to push people away. In verses 6 through 9, it reads, Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return, each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Notice that her first instinct, as she has these 2 daughters-in-law, as she wants to return home is, no, you just need to stay away. You need to stay home. And she might even have been thinking in terms of their benefit. But it's so often the tendency to push people away in the midst of adversity. In John 1, 10 through 11, it's interesting because the people who had the greatest reason to want the Messiah and the greatest problem and should have been aware of it of sin ended up pushing him away too. We often use physical distance, though, to create these barriers that remind us of our pain. In verses 6 and 7, when she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Everything had gone wrong, essentially, when they got to Moab. Had they been relieved of some of the problems of the famine? Likely. But really, there was all sorts of pain there associated with the loss of her husband and her two sons. And so there was this distance of just needing to leave that behind, as you also think about Luke 22 and verse 54. That sometimes we just need to get that separation, just like we saw Peter did, that he separated himself. And so we have that distance of, we follow afar off sometimes when we don't want to have to feel the pain, the closeness, whether it's the environment or someone individually, what that means to us. The other thing that happens when we run into these problems is we isolate ourselves emotionally, even from those we know and love. We look again at verse 8 and 9, and Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest even in the house of her husband." She was fine to leave them behind. Have you thought that perhaps she was thinking they would be with their families, they would be used to that land, and they would not be comfortable traveling? She might have decided to make that decision for her. But the point was she was going to go on alone and thought of herself as being alone would be better. And sometimes we'll do that and we don't realize we're keeping ourselves away from the problem and we're not really wanting to deal with it. And so many times we isolate ourselves, we don't want to talk to people, we're quiet, we become reclusive, and as a result, we don't let people help us. We don't reach out to them and realize that they could be a great help with us in all these things because there's a problem there that needs to be solved. Matthew chapter 5, 23 through 24 talks about a different kind of problem, but the same principle is true. You know, when we get to this point of where we're having problems, we've faced adversity, and we just want to be left alone, we end up resigning ourselves to loneliness as a self-inflicted punishment for our adversity. In a sense, it's telling ourselves that we deserve this, and I'm just going to kind of let myself get caught up in the problem and let me stew in my own sorrow. In the second part of verse 9, it says, "So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept." They didn't want to have to see her go. They didn't like this situation. They were sad too. Remember, Ruth and Orpah had suffered loss as well. But the idea of just separating from all that, and maybe their presence was a reminder of the son's death as well, but she was inflicting a type of punishment on herself. She felt so sorry for herself that she just was going to wallow in it a little bit. If you recall in 1 Kings 19 and verse 10, it was at that time where Elijah was under a lot of pressure, a lot of adversity. He was on the run as he was being chased essentially by those prophets who were following after Jezebel, the prophets of Baal, and they were wanting very much to kill him, and his life was in danger. And he describes it as he goes afar off, runs off, and he says, "I alone am left. I'm the only one." And so a lot of times we feel that way, and we don't appreciate that it is the situation and the sorrow that's creating that impression for us. And a lot of times we need perspective, and the perspective can come from those other people being around. Whenever you have a problem, don't push people away. Give them a chance to help as they wish to help. Sometimes just their presence can be a calming factor, a renewing factor, a benefiting factor for sure, because they care. It can be tempting to say, I just want time alone. And that's understandable, especially when you're going through a difficult time. But don't push people away completely. Let them be a blessing to you. Second of all, we find in verses 10 through 15, when we face challenges, we tend to undervalue ourselves. Let's consider the text. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. What a sad state of affairs that Naomi saw her value in such a limited way. And yet, we need to understand and not be too hard on her, because this was her seeing her situation and seeing the sorrow. And as a result, she looked at what she assumed were the values, that the reasons why she had her daughters-in-law in the first place. She had had sons, they'd been drawn to them. But she didn't see her value beyond that. And a lot of times that happens with a lot of us. And yet in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, the very first chapter of the Bible, it says, God speaking here, let us make man in our own image. In the image of God created He them, male and female created He them. You have value because you're made in God's image. And because you are made in God's image, you have an eternal value. But beyond that, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 23, it says, ye are bought with a price. Be ye not the servants of men. There, speaking to Christians, he's emphasizing that Jesus paid a tremendous price for you. We realize He paid that price for everyone. And that should show us how much God values us and how much value we should place on ourselves. That we bear the image of God and we have been purchased with the blood of Christ. This is how much God has valued us, and it's how we ought to value ourselves. The tendency, though, is for us to see ourselves as Naomi did. And we see our value in very limited ways. That's the point of verse 11. Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? She saw herself and her value in such a small way. One simple reason. In 1 John 2, 15 through 17, it says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passes away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Indeed, in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9 then, it says, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of Him who hath called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. When we love the world too much, we can see our value only in worldly ways, as Naomi did at that moment. But when we see ourselves in terms of spiritual value as servants of God, it lifts us up and to understand we have unlimited value if we will truly serve Him and be those who will simply do His will. You know, we mistakenly feel guilty for things out of our control. All of us do that from time to time. And if you'll notice, that's what happened to Naomi here in verses 12 and 13. Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Now that could have just been a different kind of way of stating the problem, that the Lord in some way, because He had allowed her husband and sons to die, that she felt like she was being punished. That, of course, is not really what had happened at all. These things happen. Bad things do happen to good people. But a lot of times when bad things happen to us, we go over in our minds so many times trying to figure out how we could have prevented the problem, what we could have done differently. If this had just happened, or if I had done this, or if we just thought of this beforehand, none of these bad things would have happened. But that's not how life works. And we need to be realistic about it and not feel guilty for things that are actually out of our control. Instead, we need to remember who is in control, and not in a blaming way, but rather to trust Him. In Philippians chapter 4, 6 and 7, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God, and let the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." When we get into this problem, we no longer see ourselves as worthy of others' love. And that's such a sad situation to get into. And yet in verses 14 and 15, that's where she was. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." You don't need to stay with me. I don't deserve this. Here she was being shown love in a number of ways, but she didn't feel it herself. In Romans chapter 5, 8 and 9, it says, God commends His love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, being justified by His blood, we shall be saved from the wrath to come. A lot of times we can feel like we're unworthy. Bad things are happening to us. We get down on ourselves, and we just don't think we're worthy of being loved at all. We view ourselves through a very negative light and through the light of our circumstances, not through our real value. And therefore, we try to talk other people out of loving us. We talk down about ourselves, and we don't accept compliments. We don't accept encouragement. We find reason to reject these things. And we need to remember how much God loved us in our worst and darkest days. In the worst moments in which we were away from Him, we're still lovable, not because of us, but because there are people that love, and God most of all. You should not push away others' love. You're still maybe not in any way perfectly worthy, but that's not the point. You need to receive that love and realize that you have value. Thirdly, when we face challenges, we tend to feel sorry for ourselves. Let's look at verses 19 through 21. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Now we've moved forward a little bit in the narrative, but to capture the sense of where Naomi was. Now she has made it back all the way to Judah, but she still feels sorry for herself. She's meeting up with her old friends, and all she can think about is she feels sorry for herself. And when we do that, we reject the joy and love of others. They're coming back excited to see us, and all we can do is be sorrowful and sad, and pretty much a downer to be around. We make it difficult for other people to be happy. And that's because we're feeling sorry for ourselves. We need to remember not to look so much in on our own problems that we have gotten to the point where we cannot in any way appreciate others and love others as they need to be loved. In John 13, 34 and 35, there Jesus said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." Naomi was caught up in her own sorrow and her sadness, And that caused her to fail to really feel the love and offer love for these friends who obviously meant a lot to her and she to them. And that was because she still felt sorry for herself. And because of that, when we fall into this trap, we end up allowing sadness to rule the soul. Our sadness ends up permeating our being, ruling over every decision. It changes the way we look because we're sad all the time and it's obvious on our face. People look at us and it's just they feel sorry for us. Maybe after a while, they don't even know what to do with us because we've just become a sad person. In James chapter 5 and verse 13, though, we find an important way to handle this that we often forget. If anyone's sorrow, let him pray God. If we're going to deal with sorrow and the problems that are there, let's remember who can help us through it and handle it and go to God in prayer. Instead of just internalizing everything and acting like this is something that nothing can ever change and pretty much considering ourselves sad for the rest of our lives, realize that sadness and even that depression, we can get through that valley if we will trust in God and remember that we're still loved and still cared for. When we get to this point, as verse 21 points out, we feel empty inside. She says, I went out full and the Lord has brought me home again empty. That's a real understanding of how people feel when everything's been taken away from them. That whole idea of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 2 about all things being vanity, emptiness, is something we can feel sometimes. We're empty inside, but that means we need to put something else there again, and that means our faith. We end up in that situation as she reiterates in verse 21, the second part. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? We wrongly believe the Lord is punishing us. And therefore we can very easily let Satan tempt us to lose our faith because we get the wrong idea about why we're going through difficult times. Remember in John 9, verses 2 and 3, that the disciples asked Jesus the question when they saw this man and said, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus is like, no. He says, your whole premise is wrong. That's not how the Lord works. And so we need to make sure that we do not let these things overwhelm us so much, that we internalize it and take things personally rather than understanding the nature of the world in which we live. But now we turn our attention to verses 16 through 18. When we face challenges, we ought to trust God and do so even more. Turn with me and let's look to these verses 16 through 18. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. In Psalm 16, verse 1, a messianic psalm, there Christ in prophecy essentially is saying that in the Lord, indeed, I put my trust. And that is exactly how we all ought to be, and that's what Ruth was expressing here. As she's being rebuffed by Naomi, she still is ready to move forward, and she's trusting God even more than she had to that point. Remember that coming from the Moabites, this was important for her to make a change to serve God, to serve Jehovah. And she had done that, it seems, in coming over and being married into the family and with her husband. But the point was that she wasn't going back. She was going to trust God more even through these circumstances, which was a great help ultimately to Naomi. But notice the nature of what this means when you grow and our responsibility of trusting God more. It means that we're willing to embrace new family for the long run. She said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your family. She recognized that. In Matthew 12, verse 49, Jesus, in what was a startling statement at the time, said that the people who were his family, his mother, his brothers, his sisters, are those who do the will of God. Wherever you find people, if you're a Christian, doing the will of God, you have family there. And you need to trust God enough to really feel that and accept it. And then, beyond just that relationship you have available in the church, we need to grow in a deeper trust, to trust God to care for our needs. It says, your God will be my God. He will take care of them no matter what. He's ready. Why? 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7 says, casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. You can put your needs completely in the hands of God, and He can take care of you. He's capable of caring for you, and He will care for you. A lot of times what's missing from our lives that as we're going through difficult times is our trust. It's not God's care that's missing, it's our trust in His care. And it's learning to get that trust back that helps us move forward through adversity. It is also essential that we learn to see our faith as encompassing everything in life and doing so for our entire lives. That's verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Colossians 3, verse 17 says, our faith should cover everything. So never let anyone or anything cause you to lose faith or lose your faith. When she saw that, she was determined to go with her. She stopped speaking to her. She wasn't going to be moved aside by anything that Naomi said. So now let's notice as we conclude that final verse in the chapter. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Did you notice the subtle point? Life goes on, regardless of how we decide to respond to it. Therefore, it is what we do with that life, regardless of adversity, that truly matters. Naomi and Ruth likely never imagined that they would see true happiness again, but they did. So when you are in the midst of a hardship, it can be so difficult to see beyond the pain. But I plead with all of you, when adversity strikes, don't push people away that are trying to help. It's understandable that you'll feel down and sometimes feel guilty, and it feels like a burden, but never doubt your value to God. Being tempted to feel sorry for yourself goes hand in hand with problems sometimes, but all that does is rob you of future joy. So I want you to do everything in power I'm going to right now to encourage you, despite everything you're going through, to stay with God and trust Him always. I'm Kevin Rhodes. Thank you for watching Expositions.